That's pretty provocative, isn't it? Net approval rating for mass protests following George Floyd's death among Wisconsin likely voters. This is the Marquette, I always like to tell you where I'm getting my data. The Marquette University Law School poll, and you find that in mid-June, the net approval rating, you know how they do the net, right? The net approval rating for mass protests was plus 27% in mid-June, and now is minus 1%. It's one of the many data points that causes me to ask that provocative question, which I think you saw underneath or at the top of this Facebook Live, which is, can civil unrest, not will it, but can civil unrest re-elect Donald Trump? And that's a subject I'm going to get into on CNN this morning. I want to give you a sneak peek. Sorry to be so heavy on a Saturday morning, but coming out of both of these conventions, I think this is the issue of the day. I'll begin my commentary by saying this. What impact, if any, is civil unrest having on the presidential race? 3 months ago, none of us knew the names George Floyd and Jacob Blake. Now that Floyd was killed and Blake became paralyzed at the hands of police, the country has entered a period of grief, reflection, racial reconciliation, and in some instances, violence. Where the incidents of alleged police misconduct occurred in Minnesota and Wisconsin bears added significance. Both states were decided by slim margins in 2016, and that has only heightened the political stakes in the aftermath. The Trump campaign, struggling to rebound in the face of national and swing data showing Joe Biden with a commanding lead, has sought to capitalize on the situation. I mean, there's a really interesting question now as to whether, in terms of priority, it's COVID or civil unrest. Can civil unrest re-elect Donald Trump? I'll tell you who thinks so. The Trump campaign. I mean, you think about what he said last night in New Hampshire. Did you see that? Did you hear any of the sound bites? By the way, what a tale of two Trumps. Donald Trump on Thursday night on the South Lawn, who was sedate, scripted, dare I say, sleepy, versus the jocular, jovial Donald Trump, totally off script, that you saw last night in New Hampshire. What's the answer? Different audiences that he was trying to reach on those back-to-back nights. But I digress. It is all about, when you listen to Trump and when you listen to the speakers, when you think about the lineup, the widow of the 38-year cop, now retired in St. Louis, Ann Dunbar, her very moving speech, Pat Lynch, the former union head from New York City, Rudy Giuliani, then followed by Trump. It was all about how Donald Trump represents the thin blue line that separates what has taken place in Seattle and Portland and Minneapolis and now Kenosha from coming to your neighborhood. Notwithstanding the fact that these things are already happening and he is the president. You know, he's blaming his successor for that which is happening now. But don't let facts get in the way. It might be an effective strategy. I'll tell you why it might be an effective strategy. I've got the data. And this is what I'm going to go into at the outset of my program today. But let me give you a sneak peek, okay? How about the fact that a mid-August YouGov CBS News survey, very interesting. This was before Jacob Blake, which was just last weekend. So this was before Kenosha. Question: Do you think the recent attention being given to issues of discrimination right now is too much, not enough, or about right? A plurality, 44%, said too much. So that's a national survey showing that maybe there was a bit of a turning of the tide here in this national conversation of reconciliation about race. Maybe people have sort of heard enough, had enough. That's what that survey suggests, at least a plurality. Okay, interesting, not definitive. None of this is definitive. None of this is definitive. I'm not coming to a definitive conclusion. I'm just reading tea leaves and looking at data. So let me tell you what else I find interesting. And those of you who listen to me on POTUS have already heard some of this, but not all. And thank you for listening to me Monday through Friday, by the way. According to Real Clear Politics polling averages, Joe Biden's margin over Donald Trump is now less in Minnesota than in Michigan and Pennsylvania. In other words, according to Real Clear Politics, Biden leads Trump in Minnesota by 5.3. His margin in Michigan is 7. His margin in PA is 5.5. What does it mean? Maybe that the violence and looting that followed the death of George Floyd is having an impact on Minnesota voters. Said differently, Joe Biden's margin over Donald Trump is not much higher in Minnesota than it is in Michigan or Pennsylvania, even though Clinton did better in Minnesota in 2016 compared to her performance in Michigan and Pennsylvania. That sounded like a word salad. How about if I say it this way? Hillary won Minnesota. Trump won Wisconsin and Michigan. And yet the margins now are slimmer in Minnesota than in Michigan or Wisconsin. Why? Why? Because maybe in Minnesota, the voters there have seen too much in the aftermath of the killing of George Floyd. Bear with me. I have more data that I want you to consider. Let's talk about Wisconsin. First of all, I haven't seen, Marquette hasn't gone back in the field yet. I haven't seen definitive data about Wisconsin post Jacob Blake. And frankly, I wouldn't rely on anything I had seen because that situation is still evolving. If you heard me on radio talking yesterday about the prospect of perhaps Jacob Blake having a knife, very interesting turn of events yesterday where the police union, not prosecutors, the police union came forth with information that in fact he did have a knife and that police were aware of it. I don't know all the facts there yet. I'm just suggesting that it's still murky and therefore I wouldn't rely on data if I had it, but I don't have any anyway. So here's data that precedes the Jacob Floyd shooting. While Biden has been leading in Wisconsin, his margin was already shrinking before the Jacob Blake shooting. In mid-June, Biden's lead was +8. Now it's +4. At the same time, in Wisconsin, preceding Jacob Blake, perceptions of Black Lives Matter were already worsening. How about this? Mid-June, +33%. By August, it's +10. Okay, and then the one that I showed you at the outset of this conversation, there's been a significant decline in support for protesters in Wisconsin, again, before Kenosha. So I can only imagine that these numbers have grown exponentially in the direction in which they were headed. And that is the +27% to now +1. I have, or to now -1, pardon me. And I've got to believe it's now minus a heck of a lot more than just 1. So I'm going to talk about this with Harry Enton, who is a great numbers cruncher for CNN. Harry has just published on this subject as well. And Harry notes the following. This is what I think he'll be saying on my program today. Americans' perspective on the protests seems to be changing. The percentage of Americans who see the protests as mostly legitimate dipped from 62% to 53% in August, according, now this is to NPR and PBS. Meanwhile, the percentage who believe them, people most acting unlawfully, rose from 28 to 38%. Let me say that differently. Nearly 40% of Americans, according to this survey, this is Marist and NPR, believe the protesters are acting unlawfully. So Trump is not out there on just a whim trying to drive home the argument that Joe Biden is weak in the face of this civil unrest. He's saying it because, according to this information, it's suiting his interests. And that's why I'm asking the question of whether civil unrest can reelect Donald Trump. Interestingly, there's something else going on at the same time, and I'm going to get into this on the program as well, and that is that you saw Thursday night at the White House with that acceptance speech, you've got 1,500 people sitting shoulder to shoulder like it's a wedding. You know, when they set up all those white chairs and I saw a picture of it, I thought, my God, it looks like Tricia Nixon's getting married again at the White House. And then in New Hampshire last night, same kind of a thing. And this is what Trump is going to be doing. And now I think, and I think it suits his objective as well, because, you know, to the Trump campaign, it's like COVID and the pandemic. Oh, that's yesterday's news. That's the rear view mirror. So he's going to be out there at airport hangars. I think that'll be the new drill, where he flies in, they put 1,000 people together, he gives a raucous speech, and then he leaves. Forcing Joe Biden's hand, maybe, to start to get out and do some retail politicking. Here's the lead story of the New York Times today. Biden gears up to hit the trail in swing states. So, you know, it has suited Joe Biden very well up until now to pursue the path of caution, probably because that's what the science says, and because it reinforces to his audience that Trump is reckless insofar as he rejects whatever the scientists say we should all be doing, like, you know, wearing a mask and staying 6 feet apart from people. So it's kind of a representation of their different philosophies. Joe selectively doing media, being cautious, socially distant, always seen with a mask. Trump out there like, you know, COVID, what COVID? Man, oh man, it's interesting. It is really interesting. And 6 months ago, we knew nothing of COVID-19. We hadn't heard of George Floyd, and we don't know who Jacob Blake was. And look how it's all turned. And with 60 days to go, 60 plus days to go of voting, until the final day of voting, like, who the hell knows what we're headed for? Anyway, can civil unrest reelect Donald Trump? Not will it, but can it? I hope you're posting comments here. I see that so many of you are. I can't keep up because there's so many of you who are posting things here. But make sure you do post something if you've not already, and share that question with a friend. Can civil unrest reelect Donald Trump? Is the Biden campaign, and you know, Joe is frankly saying the right things on this, but he's thus far not being heard. You know, he came out in a Twitter, it was actually a video tweeted on this subject. Then he came out and addressed it again. And I think that the Biden campaign is a little bit torn, because to speak to it too much is to play into Donald Trump's hand. But to not address it is then have Republicans saying, oh, the Democratic convention, they didn't even talk about civil unrest. You know, the Biden campaign doesn't think it's a legitimate issue. But if they don't address it, It gives it more heft. Does that make sense? That's what I'm really trying to say. So, where am I headed today? That's the subject I'm most interested in discussing. I'll talk about it at the outset of my CNN program. And then I'm thrilled because there's no one better to speak to about the mindset of the former vice president and the Biden campaign than his close friend and successor, Chris Coons, and Senator Coons will join me. I want to talk to Senator Coons about the split screen that you see when it's Joe masked up and socially distant, and then it's Trump in front of some raucous crowd. Who benefits from that? You know, I guess it suits the objectives of both sides because Republicans look at it and they say, yeah, you know, America's back. And Democrats look at it and say, hey, Trump's reckless. And thank you, Joe, for being appropriate to slow the spread of a pandemic. I also want to talk about Kyle Rittenhouse, the 17-year-old from Illinois, who is now charged in connection with the shooting, including one death in Kenosha. I'm going to, as I like to say, zapruder exactly what happened in Kenosha the other night when that transpired. It's a really tragic story, but it's a strange story. I'm not excusing the conduct of Kyle Rittenhouse, but in contrast to what I first thought, when I first heard of what was going on there, I thought, well, you know, like some militia type went to Kenosha intent on killing somebody. And the more I study the New York Times analysis, the less I believe that's the case. You know, one last thought, if I may. Just a general word of caution about Kyle Rittenhouse, about Jacob Blake, about even the George Floyd case. Resist a rush to judgment. Each one of these has its own complexities. And I think that the first story that we are inclined to believe is often not the totality of what we need to know. In each of them. I don't have any of the three totally sorted out. And yet in the world court of public opinion, there's already been judgment. Floyd was murdered. Jacob Blake was shot unnecessarily in the back. And this 17-year-old must be some kind of a militia, Trump-loving loon. I mean, that's the world court of public opinion. But I think each is more complicated. So, wow, that was a mouthful, wasn't it? Hello, Tricia Fellows, was it Barrett? Jan Brooks, Linda Anderson, Carl Pearson. Yes, he will get reelected if they keep burning and looting. James Michael, I alone can fix it. Trump, meanwhile, everything is burning. Joe Ferraro, Joe the Nerd, does the 17-year-old's mom get charged as an accessory? Great question, Joe. I don't know the answer to it. He was not legally able to carry. He'd had to have been 18. Now, initially I wondered, did he transport that AR-15 across state lines? The account that I'm reading suggests not. But he shouldn't have been there doing what he was doing. He shouldn't have been there doing what he was doing. The question is whether he was acting in self-defense. Here, I'll just give you one insight into this, if I may. You're going to have to put up with a lot of my handwriting. The New York Times has done a hell of a job on this. Again, this is the Kyle Rittenhouse case. By the way, just look at my copy, like all the notes and so forth. Let me try and show you that. This is the first shooting incident. Well, it's hard to see. Here's the bottom line. In the first shooting incident, somebody fires a gun and it's not him. A man then lunges at Kyle Rittenhouse, and Rittenhouse fires 4 times, seemingly hitting the man in the head and killing him. But because of that first, I said on radio yesterday, this is like a law school exam where you get a complicated fact pattern and then you're instructed to write for criminal law in a blue book and try and assess the arguments of both sides. If the person who lunged at Kyle Rittenhouse after that first shot thought it was Kyle Rittenhouse who was shooting, and it wasn't, and now Kyle Rittenhouse thinks this person is lunging for his gun, is Kyle Rittenhouse authorized by self-defense, even notwithstanding Joe the Nerd's point, which is he shouldn't have had the gun, but he does have the gun? Is Kyle Rittenhouse then permitted to fire in self-defense? I think that's what his lawyers are headed toward. I said on radio yesterday, somebody said to me, well, if he wasn't supposed to have the gun, how can he use it? And I said, well, imagine that you have a gun under your pillow at night and you've not purchased it lawfully. And now somebody breaks into your house. Person breaks into your house, you're defenseless except for that gun. Can you not retrieve the gun under your pillow and use it because, hey, you bought it illegally? I think the law would say you can use that gun to defend yourself, and separately we're going to sort out the gun charge of you not properly owning it. Does that make sense? Thank you, guys. I really appreciate it. Can I just say I appreciate how many of you, for whatever reason, have interest in what I say on all of my platforms, on SiriusXM, on CNN, and here on Facebook. In recent commentaries like this, just extemporaneous, where I'm working off the cuff, like 50,000 people have watched, which is just phenomenal, and I really appreciate it. So I want to focus your thinking and that of people you'll send this to on the question of, can civil unrest re-elect Donald Trump, or is this a bogus issue that voters, according to the Biden campaign, will see through? Will see through. Continue to post your comments. Thanks for watching. I'm going to go powder my noggin and get ready for television.